Most people don't know this single American decision. Just handed Canada control of the next century. Friends, I have watched empires make this exact mistake before, and I have never once seen them recognize it in time. There is a particular kind of arrogance that only the powerful can afford. It is not the arrogance of cruelty. It is not the arrogance of ignorance. It is something far more dangerous. It is the arrogance of assumption. The quiet, unexamined belief that the arrangements which brought a civilization to dominance will continue to hold simply because they always have. Rome assumed the frontier would remain manageable. Britain assumed the colonies would remain grateful. And in February of 2025, the United States assumed that Canada would remain subordinate. That assumption has now cost them the next century. For the better part of a century, Canada supplied, America consumed, Canada extracted, America refined, Canada grew, America processed. The geography was so convenient, the arrangement so naturally profitable for the larger partner, that Washington rarely had to think about it at all. And that is precisely where the danger lived, in the things powerful nations stop thinking about. Historians who have studied the decline of dominant powers will recognize this pattern immediately. It is not the moment of confrontation that breaks an empire. It is the long period before confrontation, when dominance becomes so assumed that the dominant power loses the capacity to imagine its own vulnerability. When Rome stopped asking whether the Germanic tribes might one day refuse to serve as buffer states, Rome had already begun its descent. The United States, for decades, stopped asking whether Canada might one day choose a different direction entirely. And in that silence, the foundation shifted. The decision itself appeared unremarkable to those who were not watching carefully. On February 14, 2025, the Trump administration imposed sweeping tariffs on Canadian goods, 25% on lumber, steel, and agricultural products, 15% on energy. And then came the classification that crossed a line no American administration had crossed before. Canadian aluminum and steel were designated threats to American national security under Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act, the closest ally, the longest undefended border in the world, the country that had fought alongside the United States in every major conflict of the 20th century, designated formally and legally as a security threat. What followed was not what Washington expected. American policymakers had built their calculation on 80 years of precedent. Canada would protest. Canada would send delegations. Canada would offer concessions. Canada would accept the subordinate role, as it always had, because Canada had nowhere else to go. This calculation was not unreasonable given the historical record. It was simply wrong about what Canada had become. The Canadian public did not wait for their government to organize a response. They organized one themselves. Travel to the United States collapsed by 37% in March of 2025 alone. Cross-border shopping simply stopped. Polling found that 68% of Canadians plan to avoid American goods and services for at least 18 months. This was not policy. This was a nation deciding, collectively and without coordination, that it had been insulted beyond the threshold of ordinary accommodation. The economic consequences arrived in American border communities before Washington had finished congratulating itself on its toughness. Shopping centers that had been built on the assumption of Canadian foot traffic reported declines of over 60%. Hotels in border states recorded occupancy levels not seen since the financial crisis of 2008. Within 6 months, lost revenue had reached $4.2 billion. But the damage in border retail was noise compared to what was happening in energy. Canada supplies 4.3 million barrels of oil per day to the United States. The refineries of the American Midwest and Gulf Coast were designed and built specifically to process Canadian heavy crude. They cannot simply switch to lighter domestic shale oil without retooling that would cost tens of billions of dollars. When the 15% tariff on Canadian energy was imposed, refinery operators faced an immediate cost increase of $18 per barrel. They passed it directly to American consumers. By the summer of 2025, drivers in swing states were paying an additional 41 cents per gallon at the pump. Not because of global oil markets, because of a tariff imposed on the most reliable energy supplier the United States had ever known. Republican governors in Ohio and Michigan broke publicly with the administration. The American Trucking Association described the tariffs as economically suicidal. The political architecture that the tariffs were supposed to strengthen began to fracture under the weight of consequences that had been entirely predictable to anyone who had studied the supply chain before signing the order. This is where history always turns. Not at the moment of bold decision, at the moment the consequences arrive in the lives of ordinary people who did not ask for them. While Washington was managing its own political fallout, something was happening in Ottawa that American analysts were not watching closely enough. Canada had turned to Mark Carney. He was not a politician in the conventional sense. He had navigated the Bank of Canada through the 2008 financial crisis, then become the first non-British governor of the Bank of England. He understood that the most durable forms of power are not announced. They are built. Carney did not respond to the tariffs with theater. He responded with architecture. $340 billion allocated to build east-west trade corridors bypassing American markets entirely. $280 billion directed toward critical minerals processing, ensuring Canada would capture refining value within its own borders, and $180 billion committed to the Arctic Gateway Initiative, centered on a port that most Americans had never heard of, Churchill, Manitoba. Churchill is the only deepwater Arctic port in North America directly connected to the Continental Rail Network. A cargo ship traveling from Hamburg to Winnipeg saves 6,400 kilometers by routing through Churchill rather than through American ports. That distance translates to 12 days of transit time and approximately $620,000 in fuel costs per voyage. In an industry where competitive advantage is measured in fractions, this is not a marginal improvement. It is a structural revolution. The Hudson Bay Railway was transformed with $67 billion in committed upgrades. By September of 2025, the first post-Panamax container ship docked at Churchill, loaded with Canadian wheat bound for Germany. North American trade no longer had to flow through American-controlled infrastructure. European buyers responded immediately. Canadian wheat futures jumped 23%. Potash prices spiked 31%. Capital followed logic, as it always does when the logic becomes clear enough. While the American administration was alienating the allies it had spent decades cultivating, Canada was quietly building a coalition of countries eager for a stable democratic partner. Trade agreements with the European Union integrated Canadian companies into European defense supply chains worth $244 billion. Bilateral deals with Indonesia, Vietnam, and Thailand opened the 700 million person ASEAN market. By the end of 2025, Canadian exports to the European Union had increased 34%. Exports to Asia had risen 28%. Foreign investment in Canadian infrastructure had jumped 340% in a single quarter. This is what the historical record shows again and again. The moment that determines the outcome of a power transition is rarely the moment of confrontation. It is the moment when one party quietly builds alternatives while the other assumes no alternatives are being built. Rome did not lose the western provinces because Germanic armies were more powerful. Rome lost them because the provinces simply stopped finding Roman authority necessary. Canada did not rebel, it simply built alternatives. And by the time Washington began to understand the scope of what had been constructed, the construction was substantially complete. The USMCA review date of July 1st, 2026 had been conceived in Washington as a weapon. 18 months of tariff pressure would bring Canada to the table desperate for relief. The calculation did not account for the possibility that Canada had spent those same 18 months preparing to negotiate from strength. The December 2025 Trade Representative hearings produced something entirely different from what had been intended. Over 3 days, 147 American business leaders testified against the administration's own trade strategy. The Automotive Policy Council documented that a single automobile crosses the border 7 times during its production cycle. Applying 25% at each crossing would add $1,400 to the cost of every American-made vehicle. Ford cited $1.4 billion in supply chain losses. General Motors closed 2 Michigan facilities. Lawrence Summers drew the parallel that the numbers were already implying. The situation resembled the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of 1930. The Canadian steel mill that had spent 2 years certifying for German automotive supply chains would not abandon those relationships because Washington changed its mind. The diversification, once achieved, was not reversible on Washington's schedule. Power in international relationships is not determined by the size of an economy in isolation. It is determined by alternatives. For 80 years, American leverage over Canada rested on a single foundation. Canada had no meaningful alternatives to the American market. That foundation is now gone. The leverage that defined the relationship for a century has been structurally dismantled, quietly, methodically, and permanently. While Washington was focused on the theater of tariff announcements, the communities bearing the most direct cost are not the ones whose names appear in strategic assessments: Youngstown, Flint, the Mahoning Valley, where 3 automotive parts manufacturers closed within a single year, eliminating 4,700 jobs in communities that had already absorbed 1 generation of deindustrialization. The jobs did not disappear entirely. Some moved north, as Canadian investors began acquiring American manufacturing operations and relocating them to jurisdictions where input costs were not subject to political volatility. Meanwhile, Saskatchewan farmers recorded net income increases of 34% in 2025. Western Canadian Select began trading within $3 of Brent crude prices. Canada had become a price maker with options. That is what sovereignty looks like in practice. Draft assessments from economic modeling institutions suggest that if the current trajectory holds, the reorientation of Canadian trade flows will be effectively irreversible within 3 to 5 years. Supply chains, once established, generate their own momentum. The German automotive company that has certified Canadian steel will not recertify American steel without compelling reason. The investment that has flowed into Canadian infrastructure will not redirect itself based on American preferences. History does not reverse because the initiating party decides it made a mistake. There's a particular kind of silence that falls over a room when someone realizes they have already lost something they thought they still possessed. It is not the silence of drama. It is the silence of arithmetic, of supply chains and trade flows and infrastructure investments that do not care about political intentions and cannot be recalled by executive order. Empires do not fall from a single decision, but single decisions can cross thresholds from which recovery requires a generation. The tariffs of February 2025 crossed such a threshold, not because they were uniquely severe, but because they arrived at precisely the moment when Canada possessed the institutional capacity, the political leadership, and the geographic leverage to respond with construction rather than capitulation. By the time this is understood clearly enough to change the political conversation in Washington, the infrastructure will be built. The trade agreements will be ratified, the supply chains will be operational, and Canada will be negotiating from a position no previous Canadian government has ever occupied. History does not punish intentions, it only records outcomes. And the outcome of this sequence is already written in the contracts signed in Brussels and Jakarta and Hamburg, in the grain terminals rising at Churchill, in the pipeline routes that now reach Tidewater without crossing American soil. The quiet neighbor has stopped being quiet, and by the time that fact becomes undeniable to everyone watching, it will no longer be reversible by anyone.